Hey guys, Coach Chris here, finally back with another video. In this video I would like to start what is hopefully a weekly-ish series where I play an online classical game, Game in 30, and hopefully do that once a week, analyze it, and post it here, and hopefully we all get something out of it. So this was the first game I played with that intention, and it's actually a really cool one, so glad we get to start with this one. So I'm playing black, and we get a King's Indian defense. White prioritizes central control, black prioritizes development and king safety. So I play d6 here to deter e5 right away. If white were to push it now, then we takes, queen takes, and let's just say knight takes. And now knight has a couple of good squares. Could go to d7, could go to g4. Black's doing really well here, so that's why the move d6 is played. White just develops, and we get castles, bishop to e3. And now here we get the classical King's Indian move, e5. This, first off, this does not blunder a pawn. If we get some captures here, for example, then black can take on e4, and when white recaptures, we restore material equality. We have an excellent dark squared bishop. Rooks develop. Black's doing just fine here. So e5 does not blunder a pawn, and if black isn't losing this pawn, then it's just a nice central strike, hitting that central pawn, which cannot be protected by another pawn because the E and C pawns are advanced in the center. So white responds in the most principled way, and that's to take more space. And now this is the classical King's Indian pawn structure. Black's pawn chain points to the king side, indicating that he'll want to attack there. That is often done by moving the knight out of the way to maybe h5, maybe d7, maybe e8, and then throwing Freddy the F pawn up the board and going for a big kingside attack. White's pawn chain, after he moves the knight, plays f3, will typically point towards the queen side, indicating that that's the side of the board that white wants to play on. So we get a really interesting battle of ideas. Often, even if black is objectively lost on the queen side, doesn't matter if you checkmate white. And defending is so hard for us non-title players, so King's Indian is a really fun opening to play for black. Here I play knight to g4. There's a strategic threat in this position for white. If white is able to play knight d2 and bishop to e2 and have that minor piece formation where the bishops are on e2 and e3, knights are on c3 and d2, then black's actually in quite a bit of trouble because the bishops combined with the pawns do a good job of stopping black's queenside play, and the knights are ready to roll on the queen side with b4, c5, knight coming to c4. So in order to disrupt white, play knight g4 here. And in closed pawn structures, time is often not as important. You often have time to maneuver your pieces to the best possible squares. Because the center isn't open, it's harder for the opponent to blow it open, and so you often have time to put your pieces on their ideal squares, and you can sometimes afford to move the same piece twice. So here, knight g4 disrupting white, not allowing the perfect setup. Bishop g5 attacking the queen with tempo, but f6. Bishop drops back to d2, and now get to play the typical King's Indian break f5. And again, our pawns are pointing to the king side. We want to start an attack there. f5 is critical in the King's Indian. Bishop e2, and here I played the sort of the standard King's Indian move a5, which I'll explain in a bit, but here I missed a tactic that I don't think I've seen this pattern before, but it's really cool. The idea is White hasn't castled yet. Our f-pawn's up the board already. It allows a really interesting tactic. Knight takes f2, forking queen and rook, so king would really need to capture. We take on e4, attacking the knight, opening up the rook, and if white recaptures here, well, queen h4, and this leads to some interesting moves. We're attacking the queen, we're attacking the king, attacking the knight. So if, g3, we take here, and if the knight retreats, then e4 is coming. The knight's pinned because of the rook. Now the bishop is opened up, and we're going to get our material back. Really interesting sacrifice, was not on my radar at all. I was not familiar with that pattern. I played the more typical King's Indian move, a5. The idea behind a5 is that once white played d5, that left the c5 square as a potential outpost for our b8 knight. The knight can get there by going to d7 first, or via the a6 square. a5 is played to prevent white from playing b4 to evict that knight. So if I had just played knight a6 to c5 right away, white could kick the knight anytime he wanted with b4. So that's the idea of a5, cementing the c5 square as an outpost. White castles, knight a6, sticking to the plan. White retreats his knight, attacking mine. I just drop it back, increasing the pressure on e4. White solidifies e4 with f3. I attack it again with knight c5, putting the knight on the desired outpost. White attacks my knight, and I can't really start taking here yet. I mean, I can, it's just not ideal. White ends up wrecking the pawn structure because white, instead of recapturing right away, first takes the knight on c5. So first I played b6 with the idea of if white captures, which is what happened in the game, I recapture with the b pawn, and now I have a nice b file. The extra c pawn and the a pawn do a really great job of clamping down on white's desired queenside expansion, so I really like this position for black. White plays a3, hoping to eventually get the queen side play started, but it's not a threat yet. And so I have time to develop my last minor piece. Queen c2, just kind of developing, controlling e4 some more. And here I thought about the typical King's Indian plan of playing f4, g5, h5, g4, and trying to slowly break through on the king side. But it felt slow in this position. None of those moves come with tempo, and eventually white can try to get b4 through. So I tried to play a more active, piece-oriented plan and played knight to h5. We'll see the idea on the next move. White drops his knight back, again trying to prepare b4, but it gives me time to play knight f4. And the idea here is that if white ever takes, which actually happens in the game later, then black recaptures with the e-pawn, and that makes the dark squared bishop an absolute monster. White wouldn't have a dark squared bishop. This would be an uncontested piece, and the dark squared bishop is often the pride and sorrow for black in the King's Indian. If black's dark squared bishop gets active, then black usually has an outstanding game. If it stays passive all game, then black's in trouble. Whether or not this bishop gets active, this bishop often serves as a deterrent effect. We'll see in the game why taking is often not ideal for white, and so white often has to suffer with a knight on f4 in the King's Indian. So right now, white's light square bishop is hanging, and so defends it by playing bishop d3, also defending the e4 square. But at this point I play a4. I hadn't played it earlier because I was a little bit worried about bishop from e2 going to d1, knight coming to c3, and then with the bishop, queen, and knight all hitting that pawn, I thought that pawn might be a little loose. But now that the knight is on a2 and the bishop is on d3, then this pawn is going to be perfectly safe, or at least safe enough, long enough for me to attack on the king side. Okay, so white realizes that the b4 break, well, that the knight is looking a little bit silly on a2 now. The reason I play a4, by the way, is so that if white ever plays b3 or b4, then I just take. That leaves the a3 pawn isolated on this open file. In an endgame, it could be potentially dangerous, but I'm playing the King's Indian. I have no intention of allowing this to go to an endgame. I'm trying to checkmate in the middle game. So white fixes the knight on a2, puts it back on c3, and I play queen g5, threatening checkmate. If rook f2, then knight h3, forking the king and the rook. The pawn couldn't capture because it would be pinned by the queen. So queen g5, and white takes the knight. And here we get to see another very thematic idea from the King's Indian. You take with the e pawn, unleashing that dark squared bishop. White puts his rook in the center, which is usually a great idea. But again, in this position, white typically wants to be playing on the queen side, and there's not really anything to do on the e-file. This square is covered by my pawn and bishop, this square is covered by my bishop, this square is covered by the queen, this square is covered by the bishop and the rook. So there are no entry points, and so the rook looks good on the e-file, but doesn't actually accomplish anything. Bishop to d4 check, the uncontested dark squared bishop enters the game with a devastating effect. King h1, and here I play a mistake according to the engine. I knew that queen to h4 was on the agenda. The engine likes taking on e4 first, which I rejected because it allows his bishop, knight, and queen kind of into the game. They can use the e4 square as a jumping off point. So that's why I played queen to h4. I thought he would take, and he did. Again, he's trying to open up the e-file, provide the e4 square for his pieces. And here I played a move that I really like. I took back with the g-pawn. And the idea is to just control the e4 square. If I control the e4 square, then his bishop, knight, and queen can't really get to a part of the board that matters, and that's the king side. At this point in the game, I can basically just ignore white's demonstrations on the queen side because I'm going for checkmate. And the game concludes very quickly. In this position, I already saw a beautiful mating idea that I hoped would work out. And it did. White begins to double on the e-file. I play rook f6, and white is completely oblivious to the danger. I guess he thought that he had time, or I guess he thought that I would be playing rook h6, trying to mate on the h-file, and that he would have time for h3 in response. But there's no need to prepare anything. The mate is already here, and how cool is this for our first game in this new series? Queen takes h2 check. King has to recapture, and rook h6 checkmate. This pawn controls the g3 square, bishop prevents any flight this way, and the rook delivers mate on the h-file. So, really interesting game. Hope you enjoyed it. Let's run it back real quick. Prioritize development. Strike in the center. Even if you start with development, you still have to fight for the center. Disruption. Playing on my side of the board. Cementing the c5 square for the knight. And then just trying to balance my attacking ideas and stopping my opponents. Get to see a really cool typical King's Indian plan, getting that bishop active, and then really cool queen sack for checkmate. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed it. Keep grinding those tactics.